Today is also the last day of the 8-day observance of Passover, the celebration of the delivery of the Israelites from bondage in the land of Egypt. These two celebrations don't always occur at the same time, but they are usually close to one another. In Western Christianity, Easter occurs on the Sunday after the first full moon on or after the vernal equinox. Isn't that interesting? So Christianity, which presumably was a step above and away from earth-centered ideas of paganism, nevertheless uses the rhythm of the earth to establish its holiest day. Establishing the dates of Passover is somewhat more complicated. The Jewish calendar is a lunar one with 354 days a year instead of the 365 days of the solar calendar, which is the calendar used almost all over the world because it keeps the seasons at the same time of the calendar year. The Jewish calendar therefore slides backwards every year, but this is corrected by the insertion of an additional month periodically, so the solar calendar, which we all use, Jewish observances slide backwards a few days a year until that extra lunar month is inserted and they jump forward 28 days. Now, this keeps them in line with the seasons even though they jump around a little bit. It's interesting to note that Islam also uses a lunar calendar of 354 days, but it doesn't insert any corrective extra months. That's why in Islam, events slide backwards 11 days a year, and their holy days, like Ramadan, for example, might occur at any time during the year, at any of the 4 seasons. At 11 days a year, it takes 33 years for the Islamic calendar to go completely around the seasons. This use of different calendars explains why Easter and Passover are always close, but not always exactly in the same relationship. Easter almost always falls during Passover, but occasionally it does not. The last time this happened was in 2016. It was only a few days out, but it was not during Passover. So today is the last day of Holy Week for Christians and the last day of Passover for Jews. What do these holy days mean? Easter, of course, represents the day on which Jesus was resurrected from the dead after dying on the cross 3 days before. Jesus, of course, was a Jew and would have observed Passover. The Gospel of John reports that Jesus was 30 years old when he began his ministry, and it recounts 3 separate Passovers which it included, and therefore Jesus was 33 years old when he was crucified. Now, the crucifixion is probably the easiest part of the Easter story for most of us to believe. Probably most of us believe it happened or could have happened if we spend any time thinking about it. After all, we know from other historical evidence that crucifixion was a form of execution employed by the Romans at the time of Jesus. It was often the means employed for enemies of the state because it was so cruel and inhumane. We know Jesus could well have been understood as an enemy of the state for the prophetic stances he took. He was gentle, but he spoke truth to power. It isn't hard to believe he would have been executed by the state. Now, the second part of the story, the resurrection, is much harder to believe. My guess would be that there possibly is no one here this morning who believes the gospel accounts of the appearances of Jesus after his death as literal reports of things that actually happened. I do not believe them that way, but I do want to say that I have the deepest and most profound respect for those who do. The story is very complex from a psychological and spiritual standpoint, and however it is received by any individual is deserving of respect, even if we disagree. And I hope you share that attitude with me. Not all who call themselves Christians include the resurrection in their thinking. Thomas Jefferson, the ultimate rationalist, leaves the resurrection out of his conflation of the 4 Gospels, which we know as the Jefferson Bible. You probably have a copy of it. Here's how that document ends. Jefferson writes, "Now in that place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein was never man yet laid. There laid they Jesus, and rolled a great stone against the door of the sepulchre, and departed." That's it. There's nothing about the resurrection. That's Thomas Jefferson. Our Unitarian sisters and brothers in Transylvania do much the same thing. They simply ignore the resurrection. Here's question 82 from the Catechism, which expresses their faith and from which they teach their children. Question: what happened after Jesus' death? Answer: after Jesus' death, his loyal disciples and followers took his body down from the cross and buried it in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. His disciples and followers loyally kept the memory of their master and teacher and proclaimed his teachings. And again, that's the end of the story for them. So Easter involves a miracle which it is difficult for us to accept. So does Passover. You remember the story. The Pharaoh of Egypt agrees to release the Israelites from bondage and let them return home after God has sent 10 plagues upon the Egyptians. Things like blood, locust, boils, fire, and so on. Finally, the 10th plague, the Passover of the angel of death, killing the firstborn in every Egyptian household, but sparing the Israelite households who marked their doorposts with blood. This, of course, is where the name Passover comes from. But after the Israelites had left, Pharaoh changed his mind and decided he wanted them back. So he sent his army to recapture them. Here's the account of what happened, reading it from the book of Exodus. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the minds of Pharaoh and his officials were changed toward the people, and they said, "What have we done, letting Israel leave our service?" So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 picked chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the water after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. He clogged their chariot wheels so they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. So the stories of both Easter and Passover involve miracles, which it is difficult, if not impossible, for a rational humanist to accept. Does this mean we simply must dismiss these stories as useless relics of the past? I think there is meaning for us in both of the stories. To me, the Easter story is a story about the resilience of the human spirit. It teaches us that we can come back to a fulfilling life even after we have been betrayed and abandoned and denied by those we love and trust. It teaches us that we can survive the most awful circumstances, perhaps even that those circumstances have something to teach us. In his little book, Letters to a Young Poet, the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke says this: "How should we be able to forget those ancient myths that are at the beginning of all peoples, the myths about dragons that at the last moment turn into princesses? Perhaps all the dragons of our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us once beautiful and brave. Perhaps everything terrible is in its deepest being something helpless that wants help from us. So you must not be frightened if a sadness rises up before you, larger than any you have ever seen. If a restiveness, like light and cloud shadow, passes over your hands and over all you do, you must think that something is happening with you, that life has not forgotten you, that it holds you in its hand. It will not let you fall. Why do you want to shut out of your life any uneasiness, any miseries, or any depressions? For after all, you do not know what work these conditions are doing inside you." The Easter story is not a simple one. It is not an unchanging one either, as our own experience and the work of scholars and critics continues to make it evolve with new meaning. However tenuous its relationship with our own faith, it is well that we pause at times to deal with the Easter story. It is a story of hope against all odds. So is the story of Passover. With all its details and subplots, the peak of the Passover story occurs in the passage I read when the Israelites are at the edge of the sea, being pursued by the armies of Pharaoh, when there is no place to turn and the end seems inevitable. Does this not also speak to our human condition? When you are at the deepest point of despair, when you are in the grasp of a destructive relationship, or the misuse of drugs or alcohol or some other destructive behavior, when you are feeling the inevitable decline and deterioration of the body and perhaps even of the mind, from which none of us can escape, and from which there is no return. When you have suffered loss which is darker than death or night, loss of a parent, loss of a spouse, that wrenching loss which seems to transcend all others, the loss of a child. When you think there is no place for you to go and that you are doomed, you are at the very place in which the Israelites found themselves when they faced the raging sea before them and the forces and chariots of the Pharaoh fast approaching from behind, doomed. But just in that darkest hour, and not before, just when it seems there is no possibility of a future, it is then that life itself steps in and opens the door for us. Modern psychology teaches us that often people who are beset by depression or involved in self-destructive behavior or abusive relationships must descend to the very bottom of the pit before they can turn around and begin to climb out. That is what happened to the Israelites in this larger-than-life story in which Moses lifted up his arms and the waters parted to let them pass. Impossible? Of course. But it is no more impossible than the future seems to us when we are in the pit of depression, despair, and grief. And yet, as the story tells us, somehow, life provides. This, then, is the value of the stories of Easter and Passover, which we observe today. The stories involve miracles which we cannot literally accept, but nevertheless contain meaning which can be valuable to us all. Let us be grateful for the stories of Easter and Passover. Those are some of my thoughts about the holy days which now surround us. What thoughts do you have? Let the congregational dialogue begin.